In the autumn of 2024, a wooden box lined with damp moss from the walls of an abandoned limestone quarry in southern Indiana was placed on a white-clothed table at a charity gala in Chicago. Inside the box were 2.1 pounds of shiitake mushrooms. They were dark, dense, flecked with pale white spots, and they smelled faintly of wet stone and deep earth. The bidding started at $500. It ended 90 seconds later at $4,217 per pound. The total for the lot was $8,856.33. The land those mushrooms came from a played-out quarry on 12.7 acres of sheer rock walls and cold blue water had been valued on the county tax rolls for the preceding 45 years at $800, not per acre, total. The woman who grew them, a 54-year-old mycologist named Margot Calloway, watched the auction on a laptop screen from a kitchen table in Stoneford, Indiana. Beside her sat her father, Harlan, who was 78 years old, and who had spent the better part of 4 decades trying to sell that land, fill that land, or forget that land. He had once offered it to the county for $10,000 and found no takers. He did not say a word. But to understand the price of those mushrooms, you first have to understand the quarry. And to understand the quarry, you have to understand the Callaways. In the autumn of 2024, a wooden box lined with damp moss from the walls of an abandoned limestone quarry in southern Indiana was placed on a white-clothed table at a charity gala in Chicago. Inside the box were 2.1 pounds of shiitake mushrooms. They were dark, dense, flecked with pale white spots, and they smelled faintly of wet stone and deep earth. The bidding started at $500. It ended 90 seconds later at $4,217 per pound. The total for the lot was $8,856.33. The land those mushrooms came from a played-out quarry on 12.7 acres of sheer rock walls and cold blue water had been valued on the county tax rolls for the preceding 45 years at $800, not per acre, total. The woman who grew them, a 54-year-old mycologist named Margot Calloway, watched the auction on a laptop screen from a kitchen table in Stoneford, Indiana. Beside her sat her father, Harlan, who was 78 years old and who had spent the better part of 4 decades trying to sell that land, fill that land, or forget that land. He had once offered it to the county for $10,000 and found no takers. He did not say a word. But to understand the price of those mushrooms, you first have to understand the quarry. And to understand the quarry, you have to understand the Callaways. Let me tell you about the quarry because it is the beginning and the end of this story. And let me tell you plainly because the Callaways were plain people and they would not have wanted it told any other way. The Calloway family did not own a farm in the traditional sense. They did not own rolling fields of corn or soybeans or winter wheat. What they owned was a wound in the earth, a great gaping cut in the bedrock of southern Indiana, roughly 900 feet long and 400 feet wide at its broadest point. with a floor that sat 110 feet below the surrounding grade. It was, depending on who you asked, either a monument to 3 generations of back-breaking labor or a scar that should have been filled in decades ago. There was no middle ground. People either saw history when they looked at it, or they saw a hazard. For most of the last half-century, the hazard view had won. The quarry was opened in 1922 by a man named Jedediah Calloway. He was not a farmer, and he made no pretense of being one. He was a man who understood stone the way some men understand horses, or timber, or the moods of a river. He could read a rock face the way a scholar reads a page, seeing in its layers and fractures a story that went back millions of years. He bought 80 acres of what the county assessor had classified as marginal farmland, paying $1,200 for the lot, a sum he had saved over 7 years of working in other men's quarries across Lawrence and Monroe counties. The land sat atop a thick, unusually pure seam of Salem limestone, the same creamy fossil-flecked stone that would eventually build the Empire State Building, the Pentagon, and 35 of the 50 state capitol buildings. Jedediah Calloway did not know any of that when he signed the deed. He simply knew the stone was good. He could feel it in the way the bedrock rang when he struck it with a hammer, a clean high note that told him the grain was tight and the calcium content was high. He trusted that sound more than he trusted any banker or surveyor. For 56 years, the Calloway Limestone Company blasted, cut, and hauled millions of tons of that pale ancient stone out of the ground. It was hard work. It was profitable work. At its peak, the company employed 87 men from Stoneford and the surrounding townships, nearly half the working-age male population in a 10-mile radius. The quarry produced dimension blocks that were shipped by rail to Chicago, New York, and Washington. It produced gravel that paved county roads from Bloomington to Bedford. It produced 3 generations of Calloway men who were known for 2 things: their quiet demeanor and their stone dust-caked hands. They were not loud people. They did not boast. They went into the earth every morning and came out every evening, and they did this for decades without complaint. It was simply what Calloways did. Jedediah ran the operation until 1951, when his hands grew too stiff with arthritis to hold a chisel. He handed it to his son, Asa, who was 34 and had been working the quarry since he was 15. Asa was a steady man, more cautious than his father, better with numbers. He modernized the equipment, bought a new channeling machine, and expanded the gravel operation to meet the post-war road-building boom. Under Asa, the Calloway Limestone Company had its best years. They built a proper office building at the quarry gate. They paved the access road. They put a sign up that read, Calloway Limestone established 1922, with the family name painted in letters large enough to read from the county highway. Then the world changed the way it always does, quietly at first, and then all at once. The seam began to run thin in the early 1970s. The richest veins had been carved away, and what remained was harder to reach, deeper in the earth, requiring more blasting and more machinery to extract the same tonnage. At the same time, foreign competition arrived. Cheap limestone from Mexico and crushed stone from massive mechanized operations in Ohio and Kentucky undercut the Callaway price by 30%. The economics that had sustained the company for half a century simply stopped working. The cost of pulling each ton of stone out of the ground exceeded what anyone was willing to pay for it. In 1979, the Callaway Limestone Company closed its gates. There were 11 men left on the payroll. Asa Callaway was 62 years old. He stood in the gravel yard on a cold November morning, handed each man his final check, and shook each man's hand. Then he locked the gate with a padlock, walked the 800 yards back to his house, and never set foot on the Quarry property again. He did not speak of it. When his wife mentioned it, he left the room. When the county sent tax assessments, he paid them silently and filed the papers in a drawer. The quarry had been his life's work, and his father's life's work before him, and now it was nothing, and the nothing of it was too large a thing for Asa Callaway to hold in his mind.
What was left behind was the pit itself, 900 feet long, 400 feet wide, 110 feet deep. The high limestone walls were sheer and pale, streaked with gray and tan where different layers of ancient seabed had been exposed by the cutting. Over the years following the closure, groundwater began seeping through the porous rock, rising slowly from below. It took nearly a decade, but eventually, the lowest levels of the quarry filled with water, creating a still, shockingly blue lake at the bottom. The water was cold, fed by springs that filtered through hundreds of feet of limestone before reaching the open air. It maintained a year-round temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer alike. It was beautiful in the way that abandoned things are sometimes beautiful. A terrible stillness dressed in color.
The remaining 67 acres of the original 80-acre parcel were sold off in pieces over the following years to pay the company's debts. Asa sold the equipment, the office building, the trucks, the rail spur rights. When it was done, all that remained in the Callaway name was the quarry itself, 12.7 acres of sheer rock walls, scrub brush that had colonized the rim, and that unnervingly placid water. The county assessed its value at $800. Nobody argued the figure. This was the inheritance of Harlan Callaway, Margot's father. Let me tell you about Harlan because he is the wall that Margot had to climb. Harlan was 33 years old when the quarry closed. He was the third generation born in 1946. Raised in the shadow of the operation the way a preacher's son is raised in the shadow of the church. He had worked in the quarry since he was 16, starting as a water boy and working his way up to a drill operator. He knew every ledge, every face, every gallery in that pit. He knew where the stone sang true and where it cracked false. He knew the taste of limestone dust in the back of his throat. a dry, chalky taste that never fully went away, no matter how many times you rinsed your mouth. And unlike his father and grandfather, Harlan hated it. He hated the noise of the channeling machines that started at 6 in the morning and did not stop until dark. He hated the dust that settled on everything. His clothes, his truck, his food, the windowsills of his house. He hated the unforgiving nature of the work itself, the way a single miscalculation with a charge could bring down a wall and kill a man. He had seen it happen once in 1971, when a blast misfired and a slab the size of a barn door peeled away from the face and crushed the legs of a driller named Obie Trent. Obie survived, but never walked right again. Harlan carried him out of the pit on his back. He was 25 years old, and he decided that day that if the quarry ever closed, he would not mourn it. When the closure came in '79, Harlan saw it not as a tragedy, but as a liberation. He was a practical man, the most practical of all the Callaways, and he believed in things he could measure. He believed in balance sheets and actuarial tables and the cold, clean logic of risk assessment. He went into insurance selling policies to farmers and small business owners across the county. He was good at it. He understood liability the way his grandfather had understood stone instinctively in his bones. He could walk onto a property and within 10 minutes identify every exposure, every vulnerability, every way the place could hurt its owner. And to Harlan, the quarry was pure liability. It was the most dangerous piece of property he had ever seen. It was an attractive nuisance in the legal sense of the term, an unfenced hazard that drew people to it precisely because it was dangerous. Every year he paid $124 in property taxes on land that generated no income. Every summer he chased away teenagers who cut through the wire fence to swim in the cold, deep water. He posted signs. He repaired the fence. He called the sheriff. It did no good. The quarry was the most exciting thing within 20 miles of Stoneford, and teenagers did not read signs. Then came the summer of 1986, and everything Harlan feared about the quarry came true. A boy named Danny Colton, 16 years old, came to the quarry on a Saturday afternoon in July with 2 friends. Danny was not a stranger. He was the son of Ray Colton, who had worked in the quarry alongside Harlan for 12 years, and who was by any reasonable measure Harlan's closest friend. They hunted together every November. Their families shared Thanksgiving dinners. Ray's wife and Harlan's wife exchanged Christmas cookies every December in tins that went back and forth so many times nobody remembered who the tins originally belonged to. Danny had been in Harlan's house 100 times. Harlan had taught the boy to cast a fishing rod when Danny was 8. The boys cut through the fence on the south side, where the wire was loose. They scrambled down the old quarryman's track, a narrow, crumbling path that switchbacked down the rock face. The water looked inviting from above, that deep, impossible blue. Danny was the first to jump. He went in clean feet first from a ledge about 20 feet above the surface. He came up once laughing, shouting to his friends. Then he went under again. The water in a limestone quarry is deceptive. It is cold enough to lock the muscles of a young man's body within minutes. 52 degrees does not sound dangerous on paper, but paper does not swim. Danny Colton went under and did not come up. His friends scrambled for help. It took 40 minutes for the volunteer fire department to arrive. It took another hour and a half for a diver to locate the body. Danny had sunk to the bottom 90 feet down into water so clear and so blue that the diver could see him from 30 feet away, lying on a floor of pale white stone, as if he had simply decided to lie down and rest. Harlan was the one they called, not the sheriff, not Ray Colton. Harlan, because it was his property, his quarry, his responsibility. He arrived while the diver was still in the water. He stood on the rim and looked down and waited. When they brought Danny up, Harlan carried the boy's body to the ambulance himself. He would not let anyone else touch him. Danny was cold and heavy with water, and his skin had already begun to take on the blue-gray pallor of the stone around him, as if the quarry had started to claim him as its own. Harlan was 40 years old. He had spent 16 years of his life working in that pit, and another 7 years trying to ignore it. In the space of one July afternoon, the quarry became something more than a financial burden. It became a grave. It became a curse. It became the physical manifestation of every failure and every fear he had ever associated with the Callaway name. The lawsuit came 3 months later. Ray Colton did not want to file it. He told Harlan so face to face in Ray's kitchen, both men standing, because neither could sit. But Ray's wife insisted, and their lawyer insisted, and the insurance company that might have covered Harlan insisted on a settlement to avoid a trial. The settlement was $25,000. It represented 2 full years of Harlan's profits from the insurance business. He paid it. He did not contest it. He believed he owed it. He and Ray Colton never spoke again. Not out of anger, not out of blame, but out of a grief so large that neither man had the words to navigate it. They would see each other at the gas station or the hardware store, and they would nod a single downward motion of the chin, and then they would look away. That was the language they had left. From that day forward, Harlan's relationship with the quarry was not merely financial. It was personal. It was a wound that would not close. Every time he looked at the property, he saw Danny Colton's body on white stone 90 feet below the surface. Every dollar the quarry cost him, every hour he spent maintaining the fence, every sleepless night when he imagined another child finding a way in, was a penance. He wanted to be rid of it, the way a man wants to be rid of a sickness. He tried to sell it in 1987, the year after the drowning. The asking price was $10,000. There were no offers. No one wanted a hole in the ground with a death attached to it. In 1991, he approached the county about using it as a landfill. He paid $3,000 out of his own pocket for an environmental impact study, only to learn that the porous limestone bedrock made it unsuitable. The water table was too vulnerable, the geology too permeable. Whatever went into the quarry would eventually seep into the groundwater that fed half the wells in the township. In 1999, he found a developer from Indianapolis who proposed filling the quarry with construction debris from a downtown demolition project. The plan fell apart when the cost of trucking the material 70 miles south proved prohibitive. The developer offered Harlan $5,000 for the land contingent on the fill deal going through. Harlan accepted. The deal collapsed. For 40 years, this was the rhythm of his life. A new idea, a small flare of hope, followed by the logistical and economic reality of the place. The quarry was too big, too deep, too remote, and too legally complicated to be worth the cost of either reclaiming it or disposing of it. It simply sat there, open to the sky, filling slowly with rainwater and regret. Harlan told his daughter the same thing 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways across 4 decades. It was his catechism, his article of faith. The quarry is worthless, worse than worthless. It is a drain, a ghost, a liability, a constant reminder of what happens when a family ties itself to a piece of ground that gives nothing back. He would say it at the dinner table. He would say it on the porch. He would say it on the phone when some new scheme fell through. And every time he said it, Margot heard something different than what he intended. He meant it as a warning. She heard it as a dare. Let me tell you about Margot. Margot Calloway was 42 years old in the winter of 2012. She had been a field mycologist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources for 18 years. She had a degree in biology from Purdue with a minor in geology. She was known among her colleagues for 2 qualities that do not often exist in the same person: an exhaustive attention to scientific detail and an almost infinite patience. She could spend an entire day in a state forest, crouched beside a fallen log, cataloging the fungal species growing on its surface, recording their colors, their textures, the precise patterns of their spore dispersal. And she would call it a good day. She was not a woman who needed fast results. She was a woman who trusted slow ones. Her work at the DNR focused on identifying and combating fungal blights that threatened Indiana's hardwood forests. Oak wilt, butternut canker, dogwood anthracnose. She spent her days looking through microscopes at the delicate branching structures of hyphae, learning to identify thousands of species by the shape and color of their spores, the way they colonized wood,
the chemical signatures they left behind. She came to understand fungi not as pests, though many were, but as a kingdom unto themselves. They were neither plant nor animal. They were the hidden architects of the forest floor, breaking down the dead to feed the living, converting fallen wood into soil, cycling nutrients through ecosystems in ways that no other organism could replicate. Decay, she understood, was not destruction. It was transformation. It was the engine that kept the whole machine running. She had grown up exploring the quarry. This was before the drowning, before the new fences, before Harlan's hatred of the place had calcified into something permanent. As a girl of 8, 9, 10, she had slipped through the old gate and wandered the rim, peering over the edge at the water far below, running her hands along the exposed limestone walls. She remembered things about the quarry that no one else noticed because no one else looked. She remembered that the north-facing walls, which never received direct sunlight, were coated in a thick carpet of moss that stayed cool and damp, even in the brutal heat of an Indiana August. She remembered that the air in the deep cuts of the quarry was different from the air above, cooler by 10 or 15 degrees, heavy with moisture, smelling of wet mineral and green decay. She remembered finding mushrooms growing in the crevices of the rock, pale things clinging to patches of rotting wood that had lodged in the cracks, and thinking they were beautiful, even though she did not yet have a name for them. She remembered her great-grandfather's hands. Jedediah died when Margot was 6, but she retained a single vivid image of him, an old man with fingers like bent rebar holding a piece of limestone up to the light and turning it slowly as if he were reading something written inside the stone. She did not know what he was looking for. She only knew that he found something there that made him smile. These memories mattered. They were the seeds that would eventually grow into the idea that changed everything. But the idea did not come to Margot in a flash. It came the way most important things come slowly through the gradual convergence of separate bodies of knowledge that had been accumulating in her mind for years. The first body of knowledge was mycological. 18 years of studying fungal biology had taught Margot something that most people never learn, that the specific conditions in which a fungus grows determine everything about the organism it becomes. The same species, given different substrates, different temperatures, different humidity levels, different mineral content in its water supply, will produce fruiting bodies that are vastly different in size, texture, flavor, and chemical composition. This is the principle of terroir, a word borrowed from the wine industry, meaning the total natural environment in which a thing is produced. Winemakers have known for centuries that the same grape grown in different soils produces a different wine. Margot understood that the same principle applied to fungi, perhaps even more profoundly, because fungi are more intimately connected to their substrate than any plant. A plant draws nutrients from soil through its roots. A fungus becomes its substrate,
It dissolves the material it grows on, incorporates it into its own body, and transforms it.
The second body of knowledge was geological. Her minor in geology had given her an understanding of what the quarry was actually made of. The Salem limestone was not merely calcium carbonate. It was the compressed remains of a shallow sea that had covered southern Indiana 340 million years ago, rich in calcium, magnesium, and trace minerals. Its structure was porous, capable of holding water the way a sponge holds water, and the water that filtered through it picked up those minerals and carried them into every crack and crevice of the rock. These two fields of knowledge had lived side by side in Margot's mind for years without connecting. The connection happened on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2011 in a place that had nothing to do with the quarry.
She was conducting a routine field survey in a state forest near Paoli, about 15 miles from Stoneford. She was looking for signs of oak wilt, a fungal disease that was spreading through the region's red oak population. She found what she was looking for, the telltale brown streaking in the sapwood, but she also found something she was not looking for. On the trunk of a fallen white oak that lay at the edge of a limestone bluff, she noticed a cluster of mushrooms she did not immediately recognize. They were shiitake-like in shape, with broad brown caps and pale gills, but they were thicker and darker than any cultivated shiitake she had seen, and they had a distinctive pattern of fine white speckles across their caps. She knelt beside them. She took photographs. She collected samples, carefully cutting the fruiting bodies at the base and placing them in labeled paper bags. She took a section of the substrate, the rotting oak wood, noting that it was pressed directly against exposed limestone. She took a water sample from a seep that was trickling down the rock face, wetting the log. Back in her lab at the DNR, she examined the samples under a microscope. The spore morphology was consistent with Lentinula edodes, the shiitake, but the cellular structure showed variations she had not seen in any cultivated strain. She ran the mineral analysis on the water sample. The calcium content was extraordinarily high, as was the magnesium. The pH was alkaline, consistent with water that had filtered through a significant depth of limestone. A thought formed. It was not a thought she wanted to have because it pointed her in a direction she had been avoiding her entire adult life, back toward the quarry, back toward the place her father called a curse. She drove out to the quarry the following weekend. She parked at the locked gate and sat in her truck for a long time, looking at the fence with its warning signs. No trespassing, danger, deep water. Harlan had put those signs up himself, one by one, over the years. Each sign was a sentence in a language of fear and guilt that he had been writing for decades. She climbed the fence. She had not been inside the quarry since she was 12 years old, 30 years earlier. The rim was overgrown with sumac and Virginia creeper, but the rock faces below were as bare and pale as she remembered. She made her way to the north wall, the one that never saw sun.
She descended carefully along the old quarryman's track, the same track that Danny Colton had used 6 years before she was born. The track brought her to a ledge about 30 feet below the rim. It was a broad shelf, perhaps 50 feet long and 12 feet deep, carved by the quarrymen decades ago as a working platform. It was shaded by the overhang of the wall above, and the air was immediately shockingly different from the air on the rim. It was cool, perhaps 60 degrees on a day when the fields above were baking at 88. It was humid, so humid that she could feel the moisture on her skin. The limestone walls were slick with condensation and coated in a thick, velvety carpet of moss. And growing on a piece of rotting timber wedged into a crack in the rock, she found them. Mushrooms. They were small, no bigger than a quarter, but their shape was unmistakable. They were the same species she had found near Powley, the same thick, dark caps with the white flecks, the same pale gills. She knelt and inhaled. The scent was rich, complex mineral with an undertone of something she could only describe as deep. It was the smell of the quarry itself rendered in living tissue. She collected samples. She tested the air temperature and humidity. She tested the water seeping down the wall. Over the next 2 weeks, she ran a full genetic analysis of the spore samples at her lab. What she found was remarkable. The strain was a wild variant of Lentinula edodes that had adapted specifically to the microclimate of the quarry. Its genetic markers showed divergence from any cultivated strain in the USDA database. It was, as far as the existing scientific literature was concerned, a previously unrecorded native strain. It existed nowhere else. It could not exist anywhere else. The combination of conditions that sustained it, the constant cool temperature, the extreme humidity, the calcium-rich water, the porous limestone substrate, was unique to the quarry. Take any one of those elements away, and the organism would either die or revert to something ordinary. Margot sat at her desk in the DNR lab and stared at her data. She was looking at a biological asset that could not be replicated in a place that her father had spent 40 years calling worthless. This was the second turning point. But there was a third, and it came from the past. 3 weeks after her discovery in the quarry, Margot went to her father's house to retrieve something from the basement. Harlan had stored all the remaining records of the Callaway Limestone Company in cardboard boxes after his father, Asa, died in 1992. Nobody had opened them since. Margot was not looking for anything specific. She was looking for a surveyor's map of the quarry that might show the location of the underground water seeps. What she found instead was a journal. It was a small leather-bound book, its cover stained with what might have been limestone dust or age or both. The handwriting inside was cramped and angular, written in pencil that had faded to a whisper. It was Jedediah's. Her great-grandfather had kept a record not of the quarry's output, not of its finances, but of its secrets. The journal entries spanned from 1931 to 1948. Most were brief, a few lines each noting things Jedediah had observed in the quarry that had nothing to do with the limestone business. He wrote about the temperature in different galleries.
He wrote about the way water pooled in certain cuts and evaporated in others. He wrote about birds nesting in the high walls and snakes sunning on the warm south-facing ledges. And he wrote about mushrooms. November 4th, 1933. Found them again on the North Gallery third bench, growing on the oak shoring timber we set last spring. Thick ones this time, dark as tobacco. Took some home to Mabel. She fried them in lard. Best thing I have eaten in a year. March 12th, 1936. Showed the mushrooms to Herschel Wyatt at the general store. He says there is no market for them, but I believe he is wrong. The men eat them on their lunch. They say they taste like steak and rain. September 9th, 1941. Tried to dry a batch and send them to a buyer in Chicago that Herschel found. They arrived in poor condition. I do not know how to preserve them properly. The science is beyond me, but the mushrooms are not. They come back every year, faithful as the frost. The last entry Margot found that mentioned mushrooms was dated August of 1948. I am 71 years old, and my hands will not close around a chisel anymore. The quarry will go to Asa, and he will do well with it. But I want to put down one thing that I have never told anyone. The value of this quarry is not in the stone we sell. It is in the stone we keep. The walls, the water, the dark, and the cold, and the damp. There is something growing in there that is worth more than any block we ever cut. I do not have the words for it, and I do not have the science for it, but someone will. Someone in this family will come along who can read what the quarry is saying. I hope they listen. Margot read those words and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Her great-grandfather had known. 70 years ago, a man with no formal education and no microscope had understood purely by observation and intuition that the quarry harbored something of extraordinary value. He had tried to tell the world, and the world had not listened. He had tried to monetize it and failed because the preservation technology did not exist. He had written his discovery down in a journal that no one had opened in decades, and he had died trusting that someone someday would find it. Margot closed the journal. She sat alone in her father's basement for a long time, holding the book in her hands. She could hear Harlan upstairs, the sound of his television, the financial news he watched every afternoon. He was 66 years old. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of the quarry, and he had never once opened this box. He had never read these words. He did not know what his own grandfather had known. She did not tell him. She was not ready. She did not yet know if the idea forming in her mind was genius or madness, and she would not present it to Harlan Calloway until she could prove which one it was. Let me tell you about the process, because the value was not in the idea. The value was in the execution. That winter, Margot Calloway spent $2,412. It was most of her savings outside of her retirement account. She ordered 1,000 high-density polyethylene grow bags from a supply house in Oregon. She ordered a specialized drill bit with a stop collar from a forestry tool catalog. She bought 10 pounds of beeswax from a beekeeper in Brown County. and she cultivated from the wild spore samples she had collected a mother culture of the Quarry's native shiitake strain. She grew it on sterilized jars of rye grain in a closet of her apartment, the same way a microbiologist would culture any organism, but with a patience and a tenderness that went beyond protocol. This strain had been growing wild in the Quarry for at least 90 years, probably much longer. It was a living artifact, as much a part of the Callaway legacy as the stone itself. She needed logs. White oak was best according to every piece of mycological literature she had studied over 18 years. The dense, tight-grained wood of Quercus alba provided the ideal substrate, rich in lignin and cellulose resistant to competing organisms capable of sustaining a mycelial colony for years. She owned a small 5-acre woodlot a few miles from the quarry purchased years earlier, with a modest inheritance from her mother. Over 3 weekends in February of 2012, when the trees were dormant and their sugar content was at its annual peak, she felled 4 white oak trees herself with a chainsaw. She was methodical in the way that scientists are methodical, not because they are taught to be, but because their understanding of the stakes will not permit otherwise. Each tree had to be healthy, with no signs of existing fungal colonization. The bark had to be intact. She cut the trunks into uniform 3-foot lengths with diameters between 4 and 6 inches. Any larger, and the mycelium would take too long to colonize the interior. Any smaller, and the log would dry out too quickly and produce only a few meager flushes before it was spent. She marked each log with a grease pencil, numbering them sequentially. She ended up with 88. Next came inoculation. She set up a workshop in the garage of her small rented house. For 2 weeks every evening after her shift at the DNR, she drilled holes in the logs. Each log received 50 holes arranged in a diamond pattern, each hole precisely 1 inch deep. The stop collar on the drill bit ensured uniformity. She could not afford inconsistency. Into each hole, she injected a small amount of the spore slurry she had cultivated from the quarry's native strain. Then she sealed each hole with a dab of melted beeswax, protecting the fledgling mycelium from contamination by wild fungi and bacteria. It was tedious, repetitive, exacting work. 88 logs, 50 holes per log, 4,400 holes drilled, 4,400 holes injected, 4,400 holes sealed with wax. Her hands cramped, her back ached. The garage smelled of fresh sawdust and warm beeswax and the faint, earthy scent of the spore culture. She worked alone in silence for hours each night. Her nephew Ledger, who was 14 at the time, came by one evening to watch. He was the son of Margot's older brother, a lanky boy with an excess of energy and a deficit of focus. "What are you doing?" he asked, poking at one of the waxy seals with his finger. "I am planting a forest inside these logs," Margot said. "Looks boring," he said. "Can I play your Xbox?" She told him she did not own an Xbox. After the logs were inoculated, they had to incubate. This was the first great test of patience, and it was the test that separated Margot's enterprise from everything her father had ever attempted. Harlan's worldview demanded immediate returns. You invested money, you expected a profit, and you expected it on a timeline you could put on a spreadsheet. The mycelium operated on a different timeline. The vegetative body of the fungus had to grow from the 50 points of inoculation in each log until it had consumed the entire piece of wood, converting the dense oak's lignin and cellulose into the energy reserves it would need to produce mushrooms. This process, called the spawn run, would take a minimum of 18 months. It could not be accelerated. It could not be incentivized. It answered to no one. Most commercial mushroom growers perform this incubation in controlled environments, heated sheds, with regulated temperature and humidity. Margot had something better. She had a 340-million-year-old climate-controlled chamber made of stone. She returned to the quarry on a Saturday morning in early March. She climbed the fence, descended the track, and spent 3 hours preparing the north-facing ledge. She swept away loose stone. She laid down a bed of gravel for drainage. She carried lengths of oak board down the track on her back and built a simple rack system angled to allow air circulation. Then, over the course of 2 full days, she and a colleague from the DNR, named Ruth Jessup, lowered the 88 inoculated logs down to the ledge on ropes. They stacked them in a crisscross pattern, alternating directions with each layer, a method that ensured every log received equal airflow. And then she waited. For the next 18 months, Margot Calloway did nothing but wait and watch and measure. She visited the quarry every weekend. She descended to the ledge with a thermometer, a hygrometer, and a notebook. The temperature on the ledge never rose above 65 degrees and never fell below 40, even when the fields above were locked in January ice. The relative humidity rarely dropped below 85%. The conditions were by any scientific standard ideal for the slow colonization of hardwood substrate by Lentinula idodes. They were, in fact, better than ideal. They were perfect. She would pick up a log each visit and feel its weight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the logs grew heavier. The mycelium was converting the dense heartwood into a more water-retentive medium, a sponge of living tissue that would eventually contain more fungal biomass than wood fiber. She could see the white thread-like mycelium growing outward from the inoculation points, spreading across the cut ends of the logs, a slow tide of white advancing through the brown bark. It was alive, and it was patient, and it operated on a clock that made human schedules look absurd. Her father saw her coming and going, her boots caked with quarry mud, her jeans damp from the humid air below the rim. He never asked what she was doing. He did not want to know. The quarry was a subject Harlan Calloway had closed, the way a man closes a door on a room where something terrible has happened. He simply looked at her and shook his head, a gesture of weary resignation that Margot had known her entire life. Once in the summer of 2013, after she had been making her weekly trips for over a year, he stopped her on the porch. "Still tending to your rotten wood," he said. It was not a question. It was a diagnosis. In Harlan's world, wood was for building or burning. Letting it rot in a hole was waste. The idea that rot might be a process of creation, that decay might be the beginning of something rather than the end of it, was alien to every principle he held.
"Yes," Margot said. "I am." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the insurance man tallying the risks, the costs, the probable losses. He saw his daughter spending her weekends in a place that had killed a boy, a place that had cost him $25,000 and a friendship and most of his peace of mind. He saw no spreadsheet that could justify it. He saw no return that could offset the risk. "It's a hole in the ground, Margot, a worthless hole. Nothing good has come out of it since 1978. Nothing good ever will."
She did not argue.
She had learned long ago that arguing with Harlan was like arguing with limestone. You could hit it all day and all you would get was dust. She went to the quarry. She checked her logs. She measured the temperature and the humidity and the advancing edge of the mycelium. She wrote her notes in a notebook that looked remarkably like her great-grandfather's journal, small and leather-bound, and filled with careful observations about a place that most people could not see. The logs were nearly ready. 18 months had passed. The spawn run was complete. The mycelium had consumed the wood from the inside out, transforming 88 dead oak logs into 88 living organisms waiting for a signal to bear fruit. All they needed now was a shock. A sudden drop in temperature that would mimic the arrival of autumn, a signal from the environment that told the fungus winter is coming. Produce your spores now, or lose your chance. Margot had read about this trigger in 100 papers. Commercial growers achieved it by soaking their logs in cold tap water for 24 hours. But Margot did not have tap water. She had something that no commercial grower on Earth possessed. She had a lake of 52-degree water, saturated with calcium and magnesium filtered through 340 million years of limestone, sitting in the bottom of an abandoned quarry that her father had spent his entire adult life trying to give away. She stood on the ledge in August of 2013. Looking down at the blue water far below, and she felt something she had not felt since she was a child standing on this same rim. She felt that the quarry was not dead. It was not a wound. It was not a curse. It was waiting. It had been waiting for 90 years since Jedediah first found mushrooms growing on the shoring timbers for someone who could read what it was saying. She began lowering the first 20 logs, one by one, into the deep cold water. They sank into the blue darkness and disappeared. She left them there for a full day. The next morning, she hauled them up, dripping and heavy with mineral-laden water, and stood them upright on the ledge, leaning them against the cool limestone wall. And then she waited one more time. 5 days. That was all it took. On the morning of the 6th day, she descended to the ledge and stopped. The logs were covered. Tiny brown pins, no bigger than the head of a match, had erupted from every crack and pore in the bark. There were hundreds of them, pushing out into the cool, damp air with a quiet insistence that felt almost aggressive. Over the next 3 days, they swelled. They broadened. They darkened. They became mushrooms, full and magnificent, their caps broad and umber and flecked with the distinctive pale white spots
that marked them as children of this specific place. They were shiitake, unmistakably, but they were not like any shiitake that Margot had ever seen or that any commercial grower had ever produced. They were thicker, they were denser, their gills were lean, creamy white, and when she picked the first one and held it to her nose, she smelled the quarry. She smelled wet stone and ancient mineral and the slow, patient decay of oak.
She smelled something that had no name in the English language, but that the Japanese, who had been growing shiitake for 1,000 years, might have called the taste of the place itself. The first harvest from 20 logs was 14.2 pounds. She brought a basket of them to her father's kitchen that evening. Harlan was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. He looked at the mushrooms the way he looked at most things Margot brought him, with a tolerant skepticism that bordered on dismissal. She washed a handful and sliced them. She heated a pan. She added butter and a pinch of salt and nothing else, because the mushrooms did not need anything else. The smell filled the small room. It was earthy and rich and complex, a savory depth that went beyond the usual mushroom scent into something that hinted at stone cellars and forest floors, and the long, slow passage of geological time. She put a plate in front of him. He picked one up with a fork. He examined it, turning it over the way his grandfather Jedediah had once turned a piece of limestone in the light. He put it in his mouth and chewed slowly. Harlan Calloway was a man of simple tastes. Meat, potatoes, corn. He had never eaten at a restaurant that required a reservation. He had never been impressed by food that came with a story. He finished the mushroom. He ate another. He looked at the plate. He looked at his daughter. "They're all right," he said. Then he went back to his paper. Margot stood in her father's kitchen and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. All right. It was the highest praise Harlan Calloway had ever given to anything that was not on a balance sheet. It was his word for a sunset that stopped him on the porch. It was his word for a piece of pie that reminded him of his mother. It was the crack in the wall of a man who had spent 40 years building walls, and through that crack for the first time, Margot could see a sliver of light. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She picked up the plate, washed it in the sink, dried it with a towel, and put it back in the cabinet. Then she drove home and sat in her driveway in the dark for a long time, thinking about stone and water and time and a journal entry written by a man
who had been dead for 36 years. The logs were ready. The mushrooms were real. The quarry was speaking. Now she had to find someone willing to listen.
Let me tell you about the market, because a product has no value until someone is willing to pay for it. And the distance between a good product and a successful one is measured not in miles, but in the willingness of strangers to open their wallets. Margot knew her mushrooms were extraordinary. She had the science to prove it. She had run a full chemical analysis at her lab comparing the Quarry shiitake to 3 commercially available strains. The results were not subtle. Her mushrooms contained nearly twice the concentration of glutamic acid, the amino acid responsible for umami, the deep, savory taste that the human tongue recognizes as richness. They had elevated levels of calcium and magnesium in their tissue minerals absorbed from the quarry water during the cold soak process. Their cell walls were thicker and more intact than commercial shiitake, which meant they held their texture during cooking instead of turning soft and rubbery. On paper, they were a superior product in every measurable dimension. But paper does not buy mushrooms. People buy mushrooms. And people in Stoneford, Indiana, in the autumn of 2013, did not know what to do with a dark, thick, strange-looking shiitake that cost $12 a pound. The Bedford Farmers Market was held every Saturday morning in the town square under a row of canvas canopies that stretched from the courthouse steps to the old feed store. It was a modest affair, 15 or 20 vendors selling sweet corn tomatoes, honey-baked goods, and the occasional jar of sorghum molasses. There was one other mushroom grower, a man named Dale Furston, who had been selling at the market for 20 years. Dale grew his shiitake indoors on blocks of compressed sawdust, the standard commercial method. His mushrooms were pale uniform and mild. He sold them for $8 a pound, and he had a loyal customer base of women who used them in stir-fries and soups. Dale was a pleasant man with a sunburned neck and a cooler full of mushrooms that all looked exactly the same. Margot set up her table on the first Saturday of September. Her setup was simple to the point of austerity. A folding card table with aluminum legs. A set of certified scales borrowed from the DNR. A hand-lettered sign on a piece of cardboard that read, Callaway Quarry Shiitake Limestone, grown $12 per pound. She had arranged her mushrooms in shallow baskets lined with damp cloth, the way she had seen vendors display produce at a market in Bloomington years earlier. The mushrooms looked magnificent against the white cloth, dark and dense and speckled, but they also looked unfamiliar. They did not look like Dale Furston's mushrooms. They did not look like anything most of these customers had ever seen in a grocery store or a garden catalog. People stopped. They looked. They read the sign. They looked at the price. They walked away. A woman in a green jacket picked one up, turned it over, and put it back down. "What kind of mushroom is this?" she asked. "Shiitake," Margot said, "grown on white oak logs soaked in limestone spring water. The woman looked at her as if she had said the mushrooms were grown on the surface of the moon. $12 a pound. Yes, ma'am. Dales are 8. These are different from Dale's. The woman looked at the mushrooms again, then at Dale's booth across the aisle where a small line had formed. She smiled politely and moved on. By noon, Margot had sold 2 pounds. She had made $24. The market stall fee was $20. She had cleared $4 for 6 hours of work, not counting the 18 months of incubation, the $2,400 in materials, the countless weekends spent descending into the quarry, or the 4 white oak trees she had felled with her own hands. Her nephew Ledger, now 16, and pressed into service carrying boxes, stood beside her with his arms crossed and his face arranged in an expression of elaborate suffering. "Nobody is buying them," he said. "Can we go home?" "1 more hour," Margot said. The next Saturday was the same. The Saturday after that, she lowered her price to $10 a pound. She sold 5 pounds. It was better, but it was not a business. It was a hobby with a negative rate of return, which was exactly what her father would have called it. And the mushrooms themselves were not cooperating. Of the 68 logs, she had not yet force-fruited 15 showed signs of contamination. Competing fungi wild molds that had infiltrated the bark despite the beeswax seals were colonizing the wood and crowding out the quarry strain. She lost those 15 logs entirely. They were worthless, soft, and black, and stinking of rot, the wrong kind of rot, the kind that destroyed without creating. Her success rate had dropped from a theoretical 100% to a practical 70%. It was a humbling number. It meant that for every 10 logs she inoculated, 3 would fail. It meant waste. It meant that scaling up would require not just more logs and more labor, but a better sealing technique, a more rigorous selection process for the substrate wood, and a level of quality control that she had not yet achieved. She sat in her truck after the 3rd failed Saturday at the market, her unsold mushrooms in a cooler on the passenger seat. And she allowed herself for the first time to consider the possibility that her father was right. Not about the quarry being worthless. She knew that was wrong. The science was clear. But perhaps he was right about the market. Perhaps the world did not want what the quarry could produce. Perhaps a thing could be extraordinary and still be unsellable. Perhaps she had made a mistake. She was pulling out of the parking lot, the gravel crunching under her tires, when a man stepped in front of her truck and held up his hand. He was not a local. She could see that immediately. He wore a crisp white chef's coat with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hands were the hands of someone who worked with knives scarred across the knuckles and stained faintly yellow from turmeric or saffron. He had dark hair cut short, and an expression of focused intensity that reminded Margot of a bird of prey that has spotted something moving in the grass. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you the woman with the limestone mushrooms?" Margot rolled down her window. "I am. Can I see them?" She opened the cooler. He reached in and picked up a single mushroom. He held it
the way a jeweler holds a stone, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, examining the cap, the gills, the stem. Then he brought it to his nose and inhaled deeply, the way a sommelier smells a cork.
"Where did you grow these?" he asked. "In the old Callaway quarry north of town."
On what?
"White oak logs, inoculated with a native strain I isolated from the quarry walls." And the soak water, it was a technical question. Nobody at the market had asked her a technical question. Nobody had asked her anything beyond the price. "The quarry water itself," she said. 52 degrees filtered through Salem limestone." He nodded slowly, still holding the mushroom to his nose. Then he said something that changed the course of Margot Calloway's life. "I can smell the limestone," he said. "It is in the finish. It is in the last thing you taste after the mushroom is gone."
How much do you have left?
"About 10 pounds. I will take all of it, and I will take whatever you have next week. Do not sell it to anyone else." His name was Theo Brandt. He was 41 years old, the executive chef and owner of a restaurant called Hearth in Bloomington, 30 miles north of Bedford. Hearth was 18 months old and already generating the kind of attention that small, ingredient-driven restaurants in college towns sometimes generate when the chef has talent and conviction and the willingness to build a menu around what the land provides, rather than what the distributor delivers. Theo Brandt was that kind of chef. He had worked in kitchens in Chicago and Portland before returning to Indiana, where he had grown up, because he believed that the limestone belt of southern Indiana, with its particular soil and water and climate, was capable of producing food that could stand alongside anything grown in Napa or Vermont or the coast of Maine. He was in the parlance of the food world, a terroir obsessive. He believed that place mattered, that the specifics of where a thing grew determined what it was, and that a chef's highest calling was to translate the character of a place onto a plate. He paid Margot $100 for the 10 pounds. He gave her his card. He told her to call him every Friday with the week's poundage. Then he got into a battered Volvo station wagon and drove north toward Bloomington with her mushrooms on the seat beside him. The following Thursday evening, he called her. "I have a problem," he said. Margot's stomach dropped. "What is it?" "I cannot take your mushrooms off the menu. I roasted them whole and served them over a dry-aged ribeye with nothing but brown butter and flake salt. I have had 4 tables this week tell me they were the best mushrooms they have ever eaten. A food writer from Indianapolis was in last night, and she used the word transcendent. My food costs are a catastrophe because I am putting too many of your mushrooms on every plate. How many pounds can you get me every week?" Margot did the math. She had 88 logs minus the 15 she had lost to contamination. 73 viable logs. She could force fruit them in rotation about 20 logs per week, soaking them in the quarry water, hauling them up to the ledge, waiting 5 days for the flush. Each flush yielded between 10 and 15 pounds, depending on the size and age of the log.
After a flush, each log needed to rest for at least 8 weeks, rebuilding its energy reserves from the remaining wood fiber. It was a biological cycle. It operated on its own clock. It could not be hurried or incentivized or threatened into producing faster.
"About 12 pounds," she said, "every week from now until the first hard frost." "I will take it," Theo said, "and I am paying you $20 a pound." Margot was silent for a moment. "That is too much." "No, it is not. I am charging $48 for that ribeye dish. The mushroom is the reason people order it. They are not paying for the steak. They are paying for the story. They are paying for the quarry." For the next 2 years, that was the shape of Margot's life. Every week, she descended into the quarry, soaked 20 logs in the cold blue water, hauled them dripping onto the ledge, and waited. 5 days later, she harvested. She packed the mushrooms in wax paper-lined boxes, loaded them into her truck, and drove the 30 miles to Bloomington. She delivered 10 to 15 pounds to the back door of Hearth every Monday morning, and Theo Brandt handed her cash. $250 a week, a little over $12,000 a year. It was a good side income enough to justify the labor, but it was not a fortune. It was not the kind of money that changed a life. It was the kind of money that sustained a belief. She expanded slowly. She felled more oak, carefully selecting only healthy trees from her woodlot and from a neighboring property whose owner gave her permission in exchange for a pound of mushrooms each month. She inoculated 200 more logs, refining her technique with each batch. She developed a better sealing method, double-dipping each wax plug and adding a thin coat of food-grade paraffin over the top, which reduced her contamination rate from 30% to under 10%. She built more stable racks on the quarry ledge, anchoring them into the limestone with expansion bolts. She worked alone, mostly descending into the quarry in the pre-dawn darkness of Saturday mornings, climbing back out as the sun hit the rim. By the end of 2015, she had 288 logs in rotation and a small but stable business, producing roughly 40 pounds per week during the growing season. The math was simple. 40 pounds at $20 per pound was $800 per week. Over a 30-week season, that was $24,000 in gross revenue. Her costs were minimal. The wood was free harvested from her own land. The quarry water was free. The beeswax and paraffin cost a few $100s per year. Her labor was her own. The profit margin was approximately 90%. Harlan noticed the checks. He was a man who noticed money the way a surveyor notices elevation changes automatically, professionally, without being asked. He stopped calling her wood rotten. He started calling it your mushroom thing. He did not ask questions. He did not visit the quarry. He did not express approval or interest or anything that could be mistaken for enthusiasm. But he stopped shaking his head when she left the house on Saturday mornings, and that, in the language of Harlan Calloway, was practically an embrace.
But the real conflict arrived not from the market and not from the quarry. It arrived from the world that Harlan understood best, the world of money and real estate, and men in expensive suits who believed that any piece of ground could be improved by pouring enough concrete on top of it. In the spring of 2016, a man named Cormac Sefton came to Stoneford.
Sefton was 45 years old. He had an MBA from the Kellogg School at Northwestern, and he worked for a land development consultancy headquartered in Chicago. He was tall, lean, and expensively dressed, the kind of man who wore a suit the way a soldier wears a uniform, as a statement of authority and belonging. His shoes cost more than most of the trucks in the Stoneford municipal parking lot. His watch cost more than some of the houses. He was confident and articulate, and he smiled frequently, a smile that reached his eyes just enough to seem genuine without quite arriving at warm. His firm had been retained by a national home builder to identify potential sites for a new residential development in the southern Indiana region. The Quarry was on their list. Sefton had studied the aerial photographs, reviewed the county tax records, and concluded that the Calloway property represented what his industry called a distressed asset with high conversion potential. In plain language, it was a hole that could be filled and built on, and the owner was probably desperate enough to take whatever was offered. He did not contact Margot. He did not know about Margot. He went to the Stoneford Town Council first, and then he went to Harlan Calloway. The public meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the town hall, a single-story cinder block building that also served as the polling station, the community center, and the venue for the annual pancake breakfast. The room was packed. Every folding chair was occupied. People stood along the walls and in the doorway. Sefton had brought maps, architectural renderings, and a PowerPoint presentation displayed on a projector he had set up himself. He was, Margot observed from the back of the room, a man who controlled his environment the way a stage director controls a set. He laid out the plan with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. The quarry would be filled not with construction debris, but with clean, engineered fill, a mixture of compacted soil and crushed rock sourced from another excavation project upstate. The cost of the fill operation would be borne entirely by the home builder. Once the quarry was filled and graded to a level surface, the company would construct a 48-home subdivision called Quarry Lake Estates. The homes would be priced between $300,000 and $400,000. The name was deliberately ironic. There would be no lake. There would be no quarry. There would be streets and sidewalks and attached two-car garages and a community pool.
We are talking about a $20 million investment in this community,
Sefton announced, standing at the front of the room with his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, his voice smooth and modulated and absolutely sure of itself. 48 new families, an increase to your property tax base of an estimated $1.2 million annually, new students for your schools, new customers for your businesses, a signal to the rest of the state that Stoneford is open for growth.
He clicked to a new slide. It was an aerial photograph of the quarry taken from a satellite, and it was not a flattering image. The quarry appeared as a gray, jagged gash in an otherwise green landscape, surrounded by scrub and bordered by the rusted remains of the old fence. It looked abandoned. It looked ugly. It looked like a problem.
This property, Sefton said, pointing to the image with the laser pointer, has been assessed at $800 for nearly half a century. It generates almost no tax revenue. It is a non-performing asset. More than that, it is a hazard. It has a documented history of trespassing incidents and one confirmed drowning fatality.
Margot saw her father flinch at that word. Fatality. As if Danny Colton were a statistic in a risk assessment report, rather than a boy who had once sat at Harlan's kitchen table eating pot roast. Our proposal, Sefton continued, will transform this liability into the single biggest economic engine this township has seen in 50 years. And we are prepared to compensate the current owner generously for the opportunity.
He put up a new slide, a single number, $140,000. The room stirred. That was real money in Stoneford. That was a number that meant something. Margot looked at her father. Harlan was sitting in the front row, and even from behind she could see the change in his posture. His shoulders, which had been hunched forward in his habitual posture of guarded skepticism, had straightened. His head was up. He was looking at the number on the screen, the way a man dying of thirst looks at a river. $140,000. After 40 years of trying to give the quarry away for a few thousand, after the lawsuits and the failed deals and the environmental studies and the developers who never called back here, was a man in a beautiful suit offering him a six-figure sum for the thing he hated most in the world. It was more money than Harlan had ever seen in one place. It was the answer to a prayer he had given up on so long ago that he had forgotten he had ever prayed it. Sefton finished. The town council president, a retired school teacher named Doris Everly, opened the floor for questions. There were a few softballs about construction timelines and traffic impact. Sefton handled them smoothly with the practiced ease of a man who had done 50 of these presentations in 50 small towns and never lost. Then Margot stood up. She had not planned to speak. She was wearing jeans and a work shirt, and her boots still had quarry mud on them from that morning's harvest. She held no slides, no charts, no projector. She had only her voice and the truth and the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing something that no one else in the room knows. "Mr. Sefton," she said, and the room went still because her voice was calm in a way that commanded attention. "You describe the property as a non-performing asset." "That is correct," Sefton said, smiling the smile. "According to the county tax assessor, its productive value is negligible." "Last year," Margot said, "that property generated $28,400 in revenue." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People turned in their seats. Sefton's smile held, but something behind it shifted the way a wall holds its shape for a moment after the foundation has cracked. "I am sorry," he said. From what activity there is no structure on the property, no agricultural operation listed with the county.
From mushrooms, Margot said.
Someone in the back of the room laughed. It was a short, involuntary laugh, the kind that escapes when a person hears something they are not prepared for. Sefton seized it. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was gentle in the way that powerful men's voices are sometimes gentle when they believe they are speaking to someone who does not understand the scale of the conversation. "With all due respect, we are discussing a $20 million development project. You are talking about growing fungus in a ditch."
The room laughed again. It was a bigger laugh this time, a communal laugh, the laugh of people who have been offered a choice between a serious man with a serious plan and a woman talking about mushrooms. Sefton had the room. He knew it. His smile broadened. Margot did not sit down. She waited. She stood perfectly still with her hands at her sides, and she waited for the laughter to die. And in the silence that followed, she spoke again. "You see a ditch," she said. "I see a cathedral." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. People stopped shifting in their seats.
"That quarry is a perfectly calibrated growth chamber designed by 340 million years of geology.
The constant temperature, the extreme humidity, the mineral content of the water, the specific microbial ecosystem on the rock walls. You cannot build what is in that quarry. You cannot engineer it. You cannot replicate it in a laboratory or a greenhouse or a climate-controlled shed. It produces a product that does not exist anywhere else on this planet." She paused. She looked around the room. She saw faces she had known her entire life. Faces that had watched her grow up. Faces that had attended her mother's funeral and her high school graduation and her brother's wedding. She was not performing. She was explaining. And she was doing it in the language that this room understood.
"Your project will bring in $1.2 million in annual tax revenue. That is an impressive number. My business at its current small scale has a profit margin of 90%. If I expand to the quarry's full capacity, which is approximately 5,000 logs, it will generate over $500,000 a year in revenue. Not for a developer in Chicago, for a family that has lived here for 100 years. And the jobs it creates will be here in this town permanent, not the 18-month construction gig your project offers."
She turned and looked directly at Cormac Sefton. He had stopped smiling.
"Your plan is to destroy a unique asset to build something generic. Every subdivision in America looks the same. There is only one Callaway quarry. Your model is based on extraction. You want to take what is here and replace it with what is everywhere. My model is based on cultivation. I want to grow what can only exist here."
The room was silent. Not the restless silence of people waiting for the next speaker, but the heavy silence of people recalculating. Margot had not made an emotional appeal. She had not talked about her family's history, or the beauty of the quarry, or the memory of Danny Colton.
She had made a business case, and she had made it in numbers, the only language that cut through sentiment, in a room full of people who paid mortgages and worried about their property taxes. Sefton was a professional. He recognized what had happened the way a chess player recognizes a fork. He could not attack her numbers without looking defensive. He could not dismiss her without looking arrogant. He could not redirect to his own presentation without acknowledging that she had shifted the entire frame of the conversation. "That is a very interesting perspective," he said. "We will certainly take that into consideration." It was the thing powerful men say when they have been outmaneuvered and need time to regroup. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. The people in the room were no longer looking at Sefton's renderings. They were looking at Margot. They were seeing something they had not expected to see: a quiet woman with muddy boots who had built something real in a place they had all written off, and who was not willing to let it go. The decisive moment happened after the meeting. Margot was walking to her truck in the parking lot when she heard her father's voice behind her. It was not the voice she knew, the dry, tired monotone of a man delivering his nightly verdict on the worthlessness of the quarry. It was tight and high and shaking with the fury she had only heard once before on the day the lawsuit settlement had been finalized. "What in the name of God was that?" She turned. Harlan was standing under the single light in the parking lot. His face pale, his hands balled into fists at his sides. $140,000, Margot. Do you understand that number? Do you have any idea what I could do with that money? What it would mean to finally be rid of that place? I know what it means, Dad. You do not know. You cannot know. You were not there when they pulled that boy out of the water. You were not there when Ray Colton's lawyer sat across from me and told me what it was going to cost. You were not there for 40 years of paying taxes on a piece of ground that gives nothing back but grief. His voice broke on the last word. He caught it. He rebuilt himself. The insurance man, the man of spreadsheets, the man who measured everything and felt nothing, reassembled his face. This was my one chance. My one chance in 40 years. And you turned it down for a mushroom hobby. It is not a hobby, Margot said. It is a business. It is a pittance. It is nothing compared to what he offered. It is not nothing, Margot said softly. It is a legacy. It is exactly what Jedediah intended. The name stopped Harlan cold. He stared at his daughter. His mouth opened and closed. Something moved behind his eyes, something old and raw, but it passed quickly, and his face hardened again. "Do not talk to me about legacies," he said. "The only legacy that Quarry ever produced was debt and death." Margot looked at her father. She could see the cost of the quarry written on him in the deep lines of his face, in the slight stoop of his shoulders, in the careful way he held himself as if bracing for the next blow. She understood in that moment that his hatred of the quarry was not about money. It had never been about money. It was about Danny Colton. It was about a friendship destroyed. It was about a guilt so deep and so permanent that he had built his entire identity around it. The identity of a man who despised the thing that had hurt him because despising it was easier than grieving it.
"It is not a curse, Dad," she said. "You just never learned how to read it." She got in her truck and drove away, leaving Harlan standing under the light with his fists still clenched and his face turned away. That was the last time they spoke about the quarry for months. A wall came down between them thicker than limestone, and Margot did not try to climb it. She had learned from her work with fungi that some things grow best in silence in the dark, without interference. She would let the quarry make her case for her. She would let time do what argument could not. But Cormac Sefton did not go away. 6 weeks after the town meeting, Margot learned from a clerk at the county recorder's office that a company called Northern Ridge Partners, LLC, had purchased an option on 18 acres of farmland directly north of the quarry property. The land belonged to the Pearsall family, who had been trying to sell it for years. The option price was $63,000. Northern Ridge Partners was registered in Delaware, but its agent of record was a law firm in Chicago that Margot recognized from Sefton's business card. She pulled up the county geological survey maps that evening and spread them on her kitchen table. The Pearsall parcel sat directly over the underground aquifer that fed the springs seeping into the quarry walls. The water that maintained the quarry's constant 52-degree temperature. The water that saturated the limestone with calcium and magnesium. The water that she soaked her logs in, the water that gave her mushrooms their unique mineral character. All of it originated in that aquifer. It flowed south through the porous bedrock, entered the quarry through a dozen seeps in the north wall, and collected in the pool at the bottom. It was a gravity-fed system that had been operating for millennia. It was the circulatory system of the quarry, the thing that kept it alive. If someone drilled industrial wells on the Pearsall parcel, pumping water for a construction project or a subdivision's municipal supply, it would draw down the aquifer. The seeps would slow. The water level in the quarry would drop. The humidity on the north-facing ledge would fall. The temperature would fluctuate. The precise, delicate, irreplaceable microclimate that sustained her native shiitake strained the conditions that had remained stable for thousands of years, would be destroyed. Sefton had not given up. He had changed tactics. If he could not buy the quarry, he would buy the water. He would control the one thing that made the quarry valuable, and he would use that control as leverage either to force a sale or to make the mushroom operation unsustainable. Margot sat at her kitchen table with the maps spread before her and felt something she had not felt since the failed Saturdays at the farmer's market. Fear. Not the fear of failure, which was familiar and manageable, but the fear of loss, the fear that something precious and irreplaceable could be taken from her by a man who did not understand what he was taking. She called Theo Brandt that night. She told him what she had found.
There was a long silence on the other end of the line.
"Can he do that?" Theo asked. "If he owns the land and obtains a drilling permit, yes. There is no law that specifically protects an underground aquifer for the benefit of a downstream user. Water rights in Indiana follow a reasonable use doctrine. If he can demonstrate a reasonable use for the water, he can pump it." "Then you need a lawyer," Theo said. "I know," Margot said. "But first I need to understand something. I need to understand what Sefton's real play is."
"His real play is to squeeze you until you sell." "Yes, but he is also talking to my father." There was another silence. "About what?" "About the Pearsall land. My father knows the Pearsalls. They hunt together. Sefton is asking my father to broker the introduction to vouch for him, and my father does not know what the land is really for. He thinks Sefton is just buying acreage for the subdivision. He does not know about the aquifer." "Would he care?" Theo asked, and there was no malice in the question, only the honest curiosity of a man who had heard enough about Harlan Calloway to wonder. Margot thought about it for a long time.
"I do not know," she said. "A year ago, I would have said no. He would have helped Sefton just to spite the quarry. But something has changed. He has not said so. He will never say so. But he sees the checks every week. He knows the mushrooms are real. He just cannot admit it, because admitting it would mean that 40 years of calling the quarry worthless were wrong. And my father has never been wrong about anything in his life."
"He was wrong about the quarry."
"Yes," Margot said.
"He was, but being wrong about the quarry means being wrong about everything. The insurance, the balance sheets, the whole way he sees the world. It means that value does not always show up where you expect it. It means that the thing you hate most might be the thing you need most. That is a hard thing for a 70-year-old man to swallow." And then the third blow fell. 2 weeks after she discovered Sefton's land purchase, Margot was called into the office of her supervisor at the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. His name was Kenneth Brower, and he was a man she had worked under for 12 years, a competent administrator who had always treated her fairly. He did not look fair today. He looked uncomfortable.
"Margot, I have to tell you about a complaint that has been filed."
"A complaint?" "An anonymous complaint, alleging a conflict of interest. The allegation is that you use DNR laboratory equipment and DNR time to conduct research for a private commercial venture. Specifically, that the fungal strain you are using in your mushroom business was isolated and analyzed using state resources." Margot felt the floor shift. It was true. Not entirely not in the way the complaint framed it, but substantially. She had collected the initial quarry samples during a field survey that was part of her DNR duties. She had run the genetic analysis on the DNR's sequencing equipment. She had used DNR databases to confirm that the strain was unrecorded. She had done all of this on her own time, evenings and weekends, using equipment that would otherwise have sat idle, and she had never taken a single dollar of state funding for her private work. But the line between her professional research and her personal discovery was blurry, and she knew it. She had known it from the beginning, and she had chosen not to think about it, because thinking about it would have meant not doing it.
The complaint has been referred to the Office of Inspector General,
Kenneth said.
You are being placed on administrative leave without pay pending the investigation. I am required to collect your lab access badge and your field vehicle keys.
Margot handed them over. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Inside, she was falling. "Kenneth," she said, "who filed the complaint?" "It was anonymous. I am not permitted to speculate." She did not need him to speculate. She knew. She could not prove it, but she knew. Cormac Sefton had found the one weapon that could hurt her without touching the quarry. He had attacked the thing that made her credible, her professional standing, her reputation as a scientist. If the investigation found against her, she would lose her job. She might face fines. Her commercial use of the strain could be challenged. Everything she had built could unravel. She drove home. She sat in her kitchen. She looked at the map still spread on her table, the geological surveys showing the aquifer that fed the quarry, the property lines that Sefton was quietly redrawing. She thought about her father, who did not know about the aquifer, who did not know about the investigation, who was at this moment probably sitting in his own kitchen, watching the financial news and believing that the quarry was finally, after 40 years, about to become someone else's problem. She was 46 years old. She had 18 years of spotless service at the DNR. She had a business that was just beginning to prove itself, producing a product that a respected chef had called transcendent. She had a native fungal strain that existed nowhere else on Earth. She had a quarry that her great-grandfather had tried to understand, and her grandfather had abandoned, and her father had cursed. And she had at this moment no income, no laboratory, no professional credentials, and no legal protection for the water that made everything possible. 3 fronts, 3 simultaneous attacks: the water, the job, the father. Any one of them could end her. Together they formed a kind of siege, a slow tightening of the walls around a position she had spent years building. Margot picked up the phone and called her nephew Ledger. He was 26 now, fresh out of college with a business degree, working a job he did not love at an accounting firm in Indianapolis. He answered on the 3rd ring. "I need your help," she said. "With what?" "With everything." There was a pause. She could hear him breathing the way young men breathe when they are being asked to step into something larger than themselves. "I will be there Saturday," he said. She hung up. She looked at the geological maps one more time. She traced the line of the aquifer with her finger from the Pearsall parcel south through the bedrock into the quarry, down through the porous limestone walls, into the pool of blue water at the bottom where Danny Colton had drowned, and where 88 logs of white oak were at this moment being transformed into something no one had ever seen. The water was still flowing. The mycelium was still growing. The quarry was still speaking in its slow mineral voice to anyone who had the patience to listen. The question was whether anyone would be left to hear it. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the story does not end with the woman standing alone in her kitchen, looking at a map. It does not end with a quiet defeat in a small Indiana town. The world is a larger and stranger place than that. And sometimes, if a thing is true enough and rare enough, the world finds its way to your door, whether you are ready for it or not. Margot Calloway spent the first week of her suspension doing nothing. She sat in her house. She did not go to the quarry. She did not return phone calls. She ate cereal from the box and drank coffee that she forgot to finish. And she stared at the ceiling of her bedroom at 3 a.m. and felt the weight of 46 years pressing down on her, like the 110 feet of air above the quarry floor. She had built her identity on 2 pillars, her science and her quarry, and both were now under siege. The DNR investigation threatened the first. Cormac Sefton threatened the second. And her father, the man whose approval she had spent her entire life trying to earn, without ever admitting she was trying, stood on the other side of both. On the 7th day, a Saturday ledger arrived. He pulled into her driveway in a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a duffel bag in the back seat and a box of files from his accounting firm on the passenger side. He was 26 years old, tall and thin, with the sharp, restless eyes of a young man who has been sitting behind a desk for 2 years and is desperate for a reason to stand up. He found his aunt sitting at the kitchen table with the geological map still spread in front of her, unchanged from the week before. The coffee in her mug was cold. The curtains were drawn. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you. What do we do first?" Margot looked at him. She had called him in a moment of desperation, the way a person throws a rope without knowing if there is anything to tie it to. She had not expected him to actually come. She had not expected the steadiness in his voice or the way he set his bag down and pulled out a chair and sat across from her as if this were a business meeting and not a rescue. "First," she said, "we need to understand what we are fighting for. Then we need to find the legal ground to fight on." "All right, tell me about the water," she told him. She explained the aquifer, the limestone filtration, the mineral content, the seeps in the north wall, the constant temperature, the humidity, the native strain that could not survive without the precise combination of conditions that the quarry water created. She explained it the way she would explain it to a colleague at the DNR, with data and specifics, because Ledger, despite his youth, was a man who respected numbers. He had gotten that from his grandfather. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "So the mushrooms are not just growing in the quarry," he said. "The quarry is growing the mushrooms. The water, the stone, the temperature, all of it. It is one system." "Yes. And if Sefton drills on the Pearsall land and draws down the aquifer, the system collapses. Yes. And there is currently no legal protection for that system. That is what I need to find out. Ledger opened his laptop. For the next 3 days, while Margot returned to the quarry to tend her logs and begin the painful work of rebuilding her morale, one harvest at a time, Ledger sat at her kitchen table and conducted the kind of research that a 26-year-old with an accounting degree and an internet connection and a reason to care can do when he sets his mind to it. He pulled up Indiana water law. He read case studies on aquifer protection in agricultural contexts. He called the Indiana State Department of Agriculture. He called the office of the state geologist. He called a professor of environmental law at Indiana University, whom he found through a chain of referrals that started with a classmate's older sister who worked at a law firm in Bloomington. On the 4th day, he called Margot at the quarry. She was standing on the ledge waist deep in the humid air, surrounded by logs that were beginning to pin. I found something, he said. There is a program called the Indiana Heritage Agriculture Initiative. It was established in 2009 as part of the state's Rural Economic Development Strategy. It allows agricultural producers to apply for protected designation for land-water resources and biological assets that are demonstrably unique, historically significant, and economically productive. If a designation is granted, the protected resources cannot be diverted, drained, developed, or otherwise altered without a review by the State Heritage Agriculture Board. Margot leaned against the cool limestone wall. The stone was damp against her back. She could feel her heart beating in her temples. What qualifies? She asked. 3 criteria. First, the agricultural product must be biologically tied to a specific geographic resource in a way that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Second, there must be documented historical use of the resource for agricultural or food production purposes. Third, the operation must demonstrate current economic viability and community benefit. Margot closed her eyes. The native shiitake strain genetically unique, unable to survive outside the quarry's microclimate. Jedediah's journal documenting mushroom cultivation in the quarry from 1933 to 1948. 2 years of sales records, $12,000 a year to Hearth. 4 employees from the town, a product on the menu of one of Indiana's most celebrated restaurants. She had all 3. Ledger, she said, I need you to build me a file, every piece of data I have, the genetic analysis of the strain, the mineral content of the water, the temperature and humidity logs from 3 years of monitoring, the sales records, the tax filings, Theo Brandt's purchase orders, and I need a copy of Jedediah's journal. Where is the journal? In a box in my father's basement. There was a pause. Does he know about it? I do not know, Margot said, and that was the truth. She had found the journal 2 years earlier, and she had never mentioned it to Harlan. She had assumed he did not know it existed, but assumption, she was learning, was a dangerous foundation to build on. I will get it, Ledger said. I will tell him I am looking for old family photographs. He will not believe you. He does not have to believe me. He just has to let me in the basement. Ledger drove to Harlan's house that afternoon. What passed between them, Margot never learned in full. Ledger told her only that Harlan had watched him descend the basement stairs with the flat, unblinking stare of a man who knows he is being managed and has decided to allow it. Ledger found the box, retrieved the journal, and left. Harlan did not ask what he had taken. He did not ask why. He stood on his porch and watched his grandson drive away and said nothing, which in the Calloway family could mean anything from indifference to approval to a grief too large for language. Margot spent the next 6 weeks building the application. She worked at her kitchen table surrounded by papers and printouts and the leather-bound journal that smelled of dust and time. She wrote the narrative herself in the careful, precise language of a scientist, making a case, but with an undertone of something deeper, something personal that crept in around the edges, no matter how hard she tried to keep it out. She described the quarry's geology. She described the microclimate. She described the native strain and its genetic uniqueness. She reproduced key entries from Jedediah's journal documenting 90 years of continuous fungal growth in the quarry. She included 3 years of temperature and humidity data plotted on graphs that showed the extraordinary stability of the quarry environment. She included her sales records, her tax filings, a letter from Theo Brandt attesting to the quality and uniqueness of the product, and letters from 4 other chefs in Indianapolis and Louisville who had purchased her mushrooms and wanted more. Ledger handled the financial projections. He built a model showing the quarry's potential output at full capacity, 5,000 logs in rotation, producing approximately 200 pounds per week, over a 30-week season, generating gross revenue of over $500,000 annually at a conservative price of $80 per pound. The profit margin, given the near-zero cost of the quarry's natural resources, was north of 85%. He compared this to the net economic benefit of Sefton's proposed subdivision, which, after accounting for infrastructure costs, school impact fees, and the inevitable decline in property values that accompanies high-density development in rural areas, was significantly less impressive than the $20 million headline suggested. Margot did not hire a lawyer to argue her case. She hired a lawyer to file the paperwork, a young woman from Bedford named Sarah Keneally, who specialized in agricultural law, and who took the case at a reduced fee because she had eaten Margot's mushrooms at Hearth and believed in them. Sarah's role was administrative. She assembled the application package, ensured it met the formal requirements, and submitted it to the Heritage Agriculture Board in Indianapolis. The strategy, the evidence, the argument, all of it was Margot's. While the application was pending, something else was happening, something Margot had not planned and could not have predicted. A food writer from Chicago named Philip Nesmith had eaten at Hearth on a Saturday night in the spring of 2023. He was a freelancer who wrote for several food magazines and maintained a blog that was read by approximately 12,000 people, most of them chefs, restaurateurs, and the kind of serious home cooks who planned vacations around restaurant reservations. He had ordered the ribeye with the Calloway Quarry shiitake. He had asked the waiter about the mushrooms. The waiter had told him the story, the quarry, the botanist, the 70-year-old native strain, the limestone water. Nesmith had written it all down on a cocktail napkin. His blog post appeared 2 weeks later. The title was The Umami Bombs of Stoneford. It was a short piece, only 800 words, but it was vivid and specific, and it captured something about Margot's mushrooms that transcended food writing. It was a story about a place, a family, and a woman who had seen value where everyone else saw ruin. The post was picked up by a food magazine in New York. A senior editor read it and forwarded it to a colleague at the New York Times food section. In August of 2023, Margot received a phone call from a woman named Claire Olmsted, a features editor at the Times. Claire wanted to send a reporter and a photographer to Stoneford for 2 days. She wanted to do a full-length feature for the Sunday magazine. Margot hesitated. She was not a public person. She did not seek attention. She understood instinctively that publicity was a force that, once released, could not be controlled, and she was not certain her small, careful operation could withstand the pressure of national exposure. But she also understood that the heritage agriculture application was pending, that Sefton's option on the Pearsall land was still active, and that public attention was a form of protection that no legal filing could match. If the quarry became famous, it became harder to destroy. She said yes. The reporter was a young man named Ellis Vautrin, who wrote with the kind of detail and patience that Margot recognized as a fellow practitioner of slow observation. He spent 2 days with her. He descended into the quarry. He stood on the ledge and felt the cool, humid air and ran his fingers over the moss-covered limestone walls. He watched Margot lower logs into the blue water and haul them up dripping the next morning. He tasted a mushroom raw straight from the bark of a log and stood very still for a long time afterward, as if listening to something only he could hear. The photographer, a woman named Iris Medford, took 300 photographs. The best of them showed Margot standing on the quarry ledge with a basket of dark mushrooms in her arms, the pale limestone walls rising behind her into a narrow strip of blue sky, the whole scene lit by the soft, diffused light that filtered into the quarry on overcast days. It was a striking image. It made the quarry look like what Margot had always said it was, a cathedral. The article ran on a Sunday in October of 2023. The headline read, "The Terroir of the Stone." It was 4,000 words long, and it told the story of the Callaway Quarry, the 3 generations of limestone men, the drowning, the father who saw a curse, and the daughter who saw a cathedral, and the mushrooms that grew in the space between those 2 visions. It was by any measure a beautiful piece of writing, and it reached approximately 4 million readers on the day it was published. The phone started ringing on Monday morning and did not stop for 3 weeks. Chefs from San Francisco, from New York, from New Orleans, from Portland, from Charleston, from restaurants whose names Margot recognized from magazines she read in waiting rooms. They did not ask the price. They asked how many pounds she could spare. They asked to be put on a list. A restaurateur from Manhattan offered to fly to Indiana to pick up the mushrooms personally
if that was what it took.
Margot could not supply them. Her 288 logs produced 40 pounds a week at peak season. She had commitments to Theo Brandt and to a handful of other regional chefs who had been with her since the early days. She could not betray them for the glamour of a New York restaurant. She would not. She built a waiting list of 53 restaurants ranked by the date of their inquiry, and she told each one the same thing: she was expanding carefully, sustainably, and she would reach them when she could. Some would wait a year. Some would wait 2. The mushrooms grew on their own schedule. She would not change that schedule for anyone. The scarcity, of course, made the demand worse. A product that you cannot have is always more desirable than a product that you can. The waiting list itself became a kind of currency in the food world, a mark of seriousness and patience. Chefs who were on it mentioned it in interviews. Food writers wrote about the list itself as a story about authenticity in an age of instant gratification. The Quarry mushrooms had become, without Margot intending it, a symbol of something larger than food. They were a rebuke to speed, to scale, to the idea that more is always better. They were proof that some things could not be rushed, and that the refusal to rush them was itself a form of value. Ledger quit his job in Indianapolis and moved to Stoneford. He took over the business side of the operation, handling orders, managing finances, coordinating the careful expansion that Margot had planned. They hired 4 people from the town, 3 men and a woman, to help with the physical labor of felling trees, cutting logs, drilling holes, carrying inoculated logs down into the quarry, and hauling harvested mushrooms up to the surface. The payroll was modest, but it was real 4 families in Stoneford, who now depended on the quarry for their living, who went into the old pit every morning, the way their grandfathers had once gone in, but who came out carrying something alive instead of something dead. The Heritage Agriculture Board convened in Indianapolis in January of 2024. Margot drove up alone. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, the most formal outfit she owned. She carried a binder containing every piece of evidence she had assembled over the previous months, organized with the same meticulous care she had once applied to cataloging fungal species in the state forests. The board consisted of 7 members, a mix of agricultural scientists, rural economists, and state officials. They had received her application. They had read the supporting documents. They had reviewed the genetic analysis of the native strain, the water chemistry reports, the historical journal entries, the economic projections. They had also received a formal objection from Northern Ridge Partners, LLC, Sefton's company, arguing that the aquifer was a shared resource, and that granting protected status to one downstream user would set a dangerous precedent for property rights in the region. Margot presented her case for 45 minutes. She spoke without notes. She described the quarry's geology, its microclimate, its biological uniqueness. She described the native shiitake strain and its genetic divergence from every known cultivated variety. She read aloud from Jedediah's journal the entries about finding mushrooms on the shoring timbers, about the men eating them at lunch, about trying and failing to send them to a buyer in Chicago. She quoted the last entry, the one about the value being in the stone they kept, and she watched the faces of the board members as the words landed. She described the economic model. She described the jobs. She described the waiting list of 53 restaurants, some of the most celebrated in the country, willing to pay $80 a pound for a product that grew in a place most people would not even stop to look at. And then she said the thing that she had not planned to say, the thing that rose up from somewhere beneath the data and the projections and the carefully organized binder.
My great-grandfather opened that quarry in 1922. For 56 years we took stone out of the ground. We extracted, we removed, we shipped away. When the stone was gone, we thought the quarry was finished. My father spent 40 years believing that. He believed the value was in what you could take out. I believe the value is in what you leave in. The water, the stone, the temperature, the biology. These are not resources to be exploited. They are conditions to be honored. If you protect this water, you are not just protecting my business. You are protecting a principle. The principle that some places are worth more intact than they are dismantled. That some things are more valuable whole than they are in places.
The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the chairwoman, a soil scientist from Purdue named Dr. Linnea Hargrove, read the decision. The application was approved. The aquifer feeding the Callaway Quarry was granted protected status under the Indiana Heritage Agriculture Initiative. Any proposed alteration to the water table within the designated recharge zone, which included the Pearsall parcel, would require a full environmental and economic impact review by the board, a process that would take a minimum of 18 months and that, given the evidence already on record, was unlikely to result in approval. Sefton's option on the Pearsall land was for all practical purposes worthless. Margot called Theo Brandt from the parking lot of the State House. She was sitting in her truck with the engine off and the windows fogged with the cold January air. Her hands were shaking. "It is done," she said. "The water is protected." "How do you feel?" She thought about it. "I feel like a log that has just been pulled out of cold water. I feel like something is about to grow." 2 weeks later, she received a letter from Cormac Sefton. It was brief typed on his firm's letterhead, and it was not what she expected. "Ms. Callaway," it read, "I want you to know that I have recommended to my client that they withdraw their interest in the Stoneford project. The Heritage Agriculture designation has changed the calculus in ways that make the development financially impractical. But I also want you to know that the designation is not the only reason. I sat in that board hearing and I listened to you speak about the quarry, and I realized something that I should have realized at the town meeting 2 years ago. I was looking at the land and seeing a surface. You were looking at the same land and seeing a depth. I have spent my career converting distressed properties into productive ones, and I believed that productivity meant
construction. You showed me that productivity can mean cultivation. I do not know how to put a value on what you have built, and that, I think, is exactly the point. I wish you well. Sincerely, Cormac Sefton.
Margot read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the binder with the rest of the Quarry documents. Sefton was not a villain. He was a man who had been trained to see the world one way, and who had encountered, perhaps for the first time, evidence that there was another way to see it. Whether he would remember that lesson or forget it the moment he moved on to the next project, Margot did not know. But the letter was honest, and she respected honesty even from the man who had tried to take her water. The DNR investigation concluded in March of 2024. The finding was mixed. The Inspector General determined that Margot had used state equipment for personal research, which was a violation of DNR policy, but that the use had been minimal, had occurred entirely on her own time, and had not diverted any state resources from their intended purpose. She received a formal reprimand and a 30-day suspension, which she had already served. Her employment was reinstated. She did not go back. She submitted her resignation the following week. The Quarry was her work now. It was the only work that mattered. Spring came. The logs pinned. The mushrooms grew. Ledger managed the orders and the expansion. They had 1,000 new logs in the incubation phase, inoculated with the native strain stacked on new racks that they had built deeper in the quarry, on ledges that Margot had identified during her childhood explorations, and that no one else had ever thought to use. The quarry was slowly being transformed from a wound into a garden, from a place of extraction into a place of cultivation. And the transformation was happening on a timeline that honored the speed of stone and water rather than the speed of money and ambition. In the summer of 2024, a chef in Chicago named Roland Eames called Margot with an idea. Eames ran a restaurant called Alabaster that had 2 Michelin stars and a reputation for serving food that blurred the line between cuisine and art. He was also the chairman of a charity that operated food banks across the south side of Chicago. Every autumn, the charity held a gala dinner and auction to raise funds. "I want you to donate a lot of your mushrooms to the auction," he said. "A small amount, the best you have. People will pay a fortune for them." The story is perfect. An abandoned quarry in Indiana producing the most sought-after mushrooms in the country. The food world will lose its mind. Margot was skeptical. She did not like the idea of her mushrooms being treated as a luxury commodity auctioned off to wealthy people in evening wear. It felt wrong, a betrayal of the quiet, patient process that produced them. But the money would go to feed people who were hungry, and that was a purpose she could not argue with. She agreed. She waited for the autumn flush, the last major harvest, before the first hard frost shut down production for the winter. She selected the mushrooms herself, choosing only the most perfect specimens from a single flush harvested at the precise moment when their caps had fully opened, but their gills were still pale and clean. She weighed them on the certified scales she had used since the farmers' market days. 2.1 pounds. She packed them in a box she had built herself from white oak, the same wood the logs were made from, and she lined the box with cool, damp moss she had gathered from the north wall of the quarry. The moss smelled of limestone and patience and the slow mineral breath of 340 million years of geology. She shipped the box to Chicago by overnight courier insured for $500, which was all the courier company would allow. She thought it was an absurd amount of insurance for 2 pounds of mushrooms. She would learn within 48 hours how wrong she was. The charity gala was held on a Saturday evening in October of 2024 in the ballroom of a hotel on Michigan Avenue. Margot did not attend. She did not own a gown. She did not want to stand in a ballroom full of strangers and watch people bid on the thing she had spent 12 years building. It felt too intimate, too exposing, like watching someone read your diary aloud to a room. Instead, she set up her laptop on her father's kitchen table. Harlan was 78 years old. He had grown thin in the past year, his frame whittled down by the slow erosion of age and the accumulated weight of a lifetime of carrying things he refused to put down. He moved carefully the way old men move when they have begun to distrust their own bodies. His hands, which had once been strong enough to carry a dead boy out of a quarry, trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup. But his eyes were clear and his mind was sharp, and he still watched the financial news every afternoon with the critical attention of a man who believed that the numbers on the screen were the truest measure of the world.
He sat in his usual chair. Margot sat beside him. The laptop screen showed the ballroom streamed live by the charity's media team. The room was full of people in tuxedos and gowns seated at round tables with white linens and candles. There was a stage at the front with a podium and a large screen. The auctioneer was a tall man with a theatrical voice and the practiced cadence of someone who had sold 10,000 lots and enjoyed every one. He introduced the Callaway Quarry lot with the flair of a storyteller, which in his profession he was. He told the room about the abandoned quarry. He told them about the 70-year-old native strain. He told them about the botanist who had seen a cathedral where her father saw a curse. He did not mention Danny Colton. He did not mention the lawsuit. He did not mention the 40 years of failure. He told the beautiful version of the story, the version that ended with mushrooms instead of grief. And the room listened the way rooms listen when they are being told something they want to believe.
Ladies and gentlemen,
The auctioneer said, "We will start the bidding at $500 per pound." A paddle went up immediately, then another. 500, 600, 700 on the left, 800. Do I hear 1,000? A woman at a center table raised her paddle without looking up from her wine glass. $1,000 per pound. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at 1,000. Do I hear 1,500? A man standing at the bar raised his hand. 1,500. 2,000 on the phone. 2,500 at the back table. 3,000. Do I hear 3,000?
Margot watched the numbers climb on the screen. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a rapid, insistent drumming that she could not slow. Beside her, Harlan sat perfectly still. He was watching the screen with the expression of a man witnessing something he does not have the framework to process, the way a person watches a solar eclipse or a building collapse, knowing that what he is seeing is real, but unable to connect it to anything in his experience.
3,500. On the floor now. 3,800 on the phone. Do I hear 4,000?
A man at a front table, silver-haired and tanned, raised his paddle with the casual authority of someone who has bid on many things and expects to win. $4,000 per pound. I have 4,000. The room is alive, ladies and gentlemen. Do I hear 4,200? The bidder on the phone came back. The auctioneer pointed to his assistant, who nodded.
4,200 on the phone. Selling at $4,217 per pound. Going once, going twice.
The gavel came down.
Sold. 2.1 pounds at $4,217 per pound. The total for the lot is $8,856.33. Congratulations to our telephone bidder, and thank you to Margot Calloway of Stoneford, Indiana, for this extraordinary donation.
The ballroom erupted in applause. On the laptop screen, the camera panned across the faces of people in evening wear, clapping, turning to each other, shaking their heads in delighted disbelief. The number hung on the large screen behind the podium like a verdict rendered by a court that Harlan Calloway had never known existed. $8,856.33 for 2.1 pounds of mushrooms. In the small kitchen in Stoneford, Indiana, there was no applause. There was no sound at all except the hum of the refrigerator and the faint, tinny echo of the Chicago crowd coming through the laptop speakers. Margot looked at her father.
Harlan was staring at the number on the screen. His face was pale. His expression was not readable in any language that Margot knew, and she knew his face better than she knew her own. It was not joy. It was not pride. It was not anger or resentment or the bitter vindication of a man who has been proven right. It was something else, something that lived below all of those emotions in a place that Harlan Calloway had kept locked for 40 years. He had spent a lifetime trying to get $10,000 for 12.7 acres of rock and water. A woman on a screen had just announced that 2 pounds of its fruit were worth nearly that much. The mathematics of it were staggering, not because the numbers were large, but because they inverted everything he had ever believed about the place. The quarry was not worthless. It had never been worthless. It had been waiting all along for someone who could see what it was. For a full minute, he said nothing. He sat in his chair and looked at the screen where a photograph of Margot's mushrooms was displayed beside the price, and he breathed slowly, and the kitchen was so quiet that Margot could hear the clock on the wall above the stove ticking off the seconds the way it had ticked off the seconds of her entire childhood. Then Harlan pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up slowly, bracing himself on the table edge with one hand. He walked out of the room without speaking.
Margot sat alone. She stared at the laptop screen where the gala had moved on to the next lot. Some other chef's donation, some other story. She thought this was it. The silence was his only concession. The man who had called the quarry worthless 1,000 times over 40 years would not find the words to say he had been wrong, because finding those words would mean dismantling the architecture of his entire adult life, and Harlan Calloway was too old and too proud and too damaged to do that.
She was closing the laptop when she heard his footsteps in the hallway. He came back into the kitchen. He was carrying 2 things.
In his right hand, he held a brittle yellowed piece of paper. It was folded in thirds, the way legal documents were folded a century ago, and the creases were so deep and so old that the paper had nearly separated along the lines. Margot recognized it before he unfolded it. It was the original deed to the Quarry property, dated March 14th, 1922. At the bottom, in faded ink that had once been black and was now the color of weak tea, was the signature of Jedediah Calloway. Below it was the signature of the county clerk and the seal of Lawrence County, Indiana. In his left hand, he held a small leather-bound journal. He laid the deed on the table in front of Margot. Then he laid the journal beside it. His hands were trembling, not with age, though age was part of it, with something else, with the physical cost of what he was about to say.
"Your great-grandfather," Harlan said, and his voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. The voice of a man speaking words that have been locked in a room inside him for decades and have grown stiff from disuse. He always said the value was in the stone. He paused. He swallowed. He looked at the journal on the table, and Margot saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, not in 46 years of watching this man's face. She saw fear. "He just did not know which kind," Harlan said. Then he sat down heavily in his chair. He put his hands flat on the table on either side of the deed and the journal, and he looked at his daughter. "I knew about the journal," he said. "I found it in 1992 after your grandfather died. I read every word of it." Margot felt the air leave her lungs.
"I read what he wrote about the mushrooms. I read what he wrote about the value being in the stone we keep, and I buried it. I put it back in the box, and I sealed the box, and I put it in the basement, and I never opened it again." "Why?" Margot said. The word came out as barely a breath. Harlan did not answer immediately. He looked at the table. He looked at the deed. He looked at the journal. He looked at his hands, which were spotted with age and scarred from decades of work. The hands that had carried Danny Colton out of the quarry water on a July afternoon in 1986. "Because of Danny," he said. "Because I could not allow that place to be anything but what I needed it to be. I needed it to be cursed. I needed it to be worthless. Because if it was valuable, if there was something good in it, then Danny died for nothing. He died in a place that had something to offer, and I missed it. I missed it, and he drowned, and Ray lost his son, and I lost my best friend. And it was all because I did not see what was right in front of me." His voice broke, not dramatically, not with a sob, but with a small dry crack, the sound of a piece of limestone giving way after years of pressure.
"If the quarry was worthless," he said, "then I was not responsible. It was just a bad place, a cursed place, a hole in the ground where bad things happened, because bad things happen in bad places. But if the quarry was valuable, if your great-grandfather was right, then I was the one who failed. I failed to protect it. I failed to understand it. I failed Danny." Margot reached across the table and put her hand over her father's hand. His skin was papery and warm. She could feel the bones beneath it, the architecture of the man who had built her the scaffolding that had held him up for 78 years, while the weight of the quarry and the memory of a dead boy pressed down on him from above. "You did not fail Danny," she said. "Danny drowned because the water was cold and he was 16 and he did not know." "That is not your fault. It was never your fault." Harlan shook his head, not the old gesture of weary resignation. A different gesture, smaller, sadder, the shake of a man who has been told something he has waited his whole life to hear and is not sure he is allowed to believe it. "Your mushrooms," he said. "They are good. They are more than good. I knew that the first time I tasted them. I knew it when I said they were all right. All right was the most I could give you, because giving you more would have meant admitting that the quarry had given you something, and I was not ready for that." He looked at the laptop, now closed where the number had been. "I am ready now," he said. That was all. But it was everything. Harlan Calloway passed away in the winter of 2025, 3 months after the auction. He died in his sleep in the house he had lived in for 50 years, 800 yards from the quarry gate. The cause was heart failure, which the doctor noted on the certificate, but which Margot understood was a diagnosis that covered a much wider territory than the medical definition allowed. When she was cleaning out his desk 3 weeks after the funeral, she found a small, lacquered box tucked into the back of the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old insurance policies, and a photograph of Ray Colton taken at a church picnic in 1983. The box was dark wood, polished smooth, the kind of box a man might keep a pocket watch in or a military medal. She opened it. Inside, resting on a piece of white cotton, was a single dried shiitake mushroom. It was dark, shrunken, its cap wrinkled by time, but its form was unmistakable. The pale white flecks were still visible on its surface, faded but intact. It was one of the mushrooms from the first harvest, the batch she had brought to Harlan's kitchen in August of 2013, the batch he had tasted and judged to be all right. He had saved it. He had taken one mushroom from that first plate, and he had kept it secretly for 11 years. He had preserved it in this box in his desk, behind the insurance policies and the photograph of the friend he had lost, and he had never told anyone.
It was his admission, his apology, his inheritance. Everything that Harlan Calloway could not say in words he had said in the keeping of a single small, dark, dried piece of fruit from a place he had called worthless 1,000 times. Margot held the box in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She was a Calloway, and Callaways did not cry, not because they did not feel, but because they felt so deeply that tears were inadequate to the task. She held the box and she smelled the faint, lingering scent of dried mushroom and old wood, and she understood that her father had loved the quarry all along. He had loved it the way people love the things that hurt them most silently, secretly, and with a ferocity that looks from the outside exactly like hate.
The Callaway Quarry Mushroom Company now has 3,000 logs in rotation. Ledger runs the day-to-day operations. They employ 4 people from the town. They sell every mushroom they can produce at a fixed price of $80 per pound to a permanent list of 30 restaurants that stretches from Chicago to Charleston. They are a small, stable, and extraordinarily profitable business. The waiting list has grown to over 100 restaurants. Margot does not hurry. The quarry does not hurry. The mycelium grows at its own pace in the dark, in the cold, in the mineral-rich air of a place that took 340 million years to build, and that will be here long after the last Callaway is gone.
The land, once valued at $800, has been appraised for agricultural purposes at $2.5 million. Not because of a developer's plan, not because someone filled it in and built on top of it, because of its unique, unrepeatable biology, because of the water and the stone and the moss and the dark and the cold and the native strain of Lentinula edodes that grows nowhere else on earth and that produces 4 times a year a fruit that tastes of time itself. Value is a story we tell ourselves. The modern world tells a particular story, a story of speed scale efficiency and clear, immediate return. It has a language for this story: spreadsheets, projections, tax bases, property values, quarterly earnings. It is a good story, and it is often true, and it has built much of what we see around us. But it is not the only story. There is another older story. It is a story about patience, about observation, about the deep, slow wisdom of a place. It is a story that understands that a liability in one system may be the most valuable asset in another. That a wound can become a womb. That the thing you have been trying to get rid of your entire life may be the thing that saves you, if only you can learn to read it differently.
This story is not told in boardrooms. It is not projected on screens or printed in quarterly reports. It is written in the language of moss and water and stone and time. It cannot be rushed. Its value cannot always be captured on a balance sheet. But when it finally bears fruit, when the slow, patient work of years and decades and generations finally pushes through the bark, and opens its cap to the cool, damp air, it is worth more than anyone could have imagined. What is worthless is only what we have failed to understand.